There are 4 verses in the book of Genesis that read like a fragment torn out of a much longer story. They arrive without warning, they end without explanation, and then the text moves on, as if nothing strange had been said at all. They describe a time before the flood, when beings the text calls the sons of God came down and took human wives, and they tell us that in those days and afterward, there were Nephilim on the earth. Mighty men, men of renown, that is all. 4 verses. And then silence. For 2,000 years, readers have stopped at this passage and asked the same question. Who were the Nephilim? Not who do we imagine they were, or who do we want them to be? What does the text actually say? And what have scholars and archaeologists actually found? Because here is what most people never learn. The story does not begin in Genesis, and it does not end there either. There is an entire ancient book, written centuries before the birth of Christ, that treats these 4 verses as the opening line of a far larger narrative. Fragments of it survived, hidden for 2,000 years in ancient desert caves. It was quoted in the New Testament, and for reasons we will come back to, it was left out of almost every Bible printed in the last 500 years. This is what the ancient texts say about the Nephilim, and what the ground beneath them has revealed. Let us begin with the words themselves, because the translation you are used to is doing a lot of quiet work. The Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 6 opens with a scene. Humanity is multiplying across the earth. Daughters are being born. And then a phrase appears that has caused more argument than almost any other in the Hebrew Bible: the sons of God, or translated more literally, the sons of the gods. These beings see that the daughters of men are beautiful, and they take wives from among them, whomever they choose. The verb the text uses is not gentle, it is the language of seizing. And then comes the line, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now, that word, Nephilim, most English Bibles simply leave it untranslated, which is itself an admission. Nobody is entirely certain what it means. The most common proposal connects it to an ancient Hebrew root, meaning to fall. On that reading, the Nephilim are the fallen ones. It is an interpretation with real weight behind it, and it has shaped nearly every popular account of this story. But there is a second possibility, and it comes from Aramaic, the language spoken across the region for centuries. In Aramaic, the related word means giant, and this is not a modern guess. When Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek in the 3rd century before Christ, producing the ancient version we call the Septuagint, they reached for a Greek word to render Nephilim. The word they chose meant giants. That translation choice matters more than any modern argument, because it tells us how ancient readers, reading in their own time, with the text in their own hands, understood what they were looking at. They did not read a metaphor. They read about giants. And immediately, the text raises a harder question. Who exactly were the sons of God? There have been 3 serious answers, and they have been argued over for 2,000 years. The first is the righteous line interpretation. On this reading, the sons of God are simply the faithful descendants of Seth, the 3rd son of Adam, and the daughters of men are the corrupt line of Cain. The union is not supernatural. It is a warning about intermarriage between the faithful and the faithless. This became the dominant Christian reading from roughly the 4th century onward, and it remains the standard interpretation in many churches today. The second reading treats the sons of God as human rulers, kings and dynastic princes who claimed divine descent, as kings across the ancient world routinely did. The sin, on this view, is tyranny, the abuse of power. rulers seizing whatever women they wanted because no one could stop them. And the third reading is the one that troubles people, and it is also, by a considerable margin, the oldest. Everywhere else that this exact phrase appears in the Hebrew Bible, it does not refer to men. It appears in the book of Job, where the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and it is unambiguously describing divine beings, members of a heavenly court, not human beings at all. If Genesis is using the phrase the way the rest of the Hebrew Bible uses it, then the plainest reading of chapter 6 is that these were not men, and that is precisely how the earliest interpreters understood it. Not later, not as an embellishment, from the very beginning. Which brings us to the book that fills the silence. In caves in the cliffs of the Judean desert, a collection of ancient scrolls was discovered beginning in the late 1940s. Among them, written in Aramaic, were fragments of a text known as the Book of Enoch, and copies of it turned up across several different caves. This was not a curiosity kept by one eccentric scribe. This was a text the community knew, copied, and preserved. Scholars date the oldest layer of that book, the section called the Book of the Watchers, to roughly the 3rd century before Christ. Which means that when the New Testament was being written, this book was already old. And what the Book of the Watchers does is take those 4 cryptic verses in Genesis and open them up into a full narrative. It gives the beings a name. It calls them the Watchers. 200 of them, according to the text, who descend to the earth and bind themselves by an oath on a mountain so that none can back out once the others are committed. The text even names their leaders, and it describes what they did. They took human wives, and they taught. That is the detail that ancient readers found most disturbing, and it is the detail that almost never survives into the modern retelling. According to the text, the Watchers did not merely transgress a boundary. They handed over knowledge that humanity was not meant to hold, metalwork, and from it, the making of weapons and armor, cosmetics and ornamentation, the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, sorcery, the reading of the stars. Every one of these is a technology, and the text presents the arrival of that knowledge as a catastrophe because it arrives without wisdom, without restraint, and without any people mature enough to carry it. The children born from these unions are the giants, and in the Book of Enoch, they are not heroes. They are a devouring hunger. They consume everything humanity produces, and when that runs out, they turn on humanity itself, and then on the animals, and then on each other. The earth, the text says, cries out against them, and there is a related work, surviving only in fragments, which scholars call the Book of Giants. It contains something extraordinary, and something that no one inventing a simple monster story would ever think to include. It gives the giants dreams. They dream of a great destruction, a garden burned, waters rising, everything they have built erased. And they wake up frightened, and they do not understand what they have seen, and they send one of their own to find someone who can interpret it. That figure carries a name that appears in ancient Mesopotamian tradition as well. And this overlap between traditions is exactly the kind of detail that keeps scholars working on these texts. These are not cardboard villains. Whoever wrote this understood something about the psychology of a creature that senses its own end approaching and cannot look directly at it. So, why is none of this in most Bibles? The Book of Enoch was never universally rejected. It was quoted, directly and by name, in the New Testament letter of Jude, which cites a prophecy of Enoch, the 7th from Adam. There is no ambiguity there. The author is quoting this book and treating it as carrying weight. Early Christian writers engaged with it seriously. Some accepted it. Others grew uneasy, precisely because of what it implied about the nature of angels and about how sin entered the world. The safer reading gradually took hold, and the book that told the other story fell out of the canon in the West. But not everywhere. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never let it go, and it is because of that church and the ancient manuscripts it preserved for centuries that we have the complete Book of Enoch today at all. The West had lost it. Ethiopia had kept it. And when European scholars finally obtained copies in the late 1700s, they were reading a text their own tradition had set aside more than 1,000 years earlier. Then the ancient scrolls emerged from those desert caves, and the Aramaic fragments confirmed that the Ethiopian tradition had preserved something genuinely ancient. This was not a medieval invention. It was ancient, and it was Jewish, and it had been circulating in the centuries around the composition of the New Testament. That is the textual record. Now, let us ask the harder question. Is there anything in the ground? Here we have to be careful and honest, because this is exactly the point where careless claims flourish. There is no archaeological evidence of a race of giants. The photographs that circulate online, showing enormous skeletons half unearthed in the sand, are fabrications. Many of them come from digital art competitions. They have been traced back to their sources. They are not real, and repeating them does the subject no favors. But that is not the same as saying the ground has nothing to say. It has a great deal to say, and what it says is more interesting than the fakes. Start with the Hebrew Bible itself, which is remarkably specific in places. In the Book of Numbers, when scouts return from the land of Canaan, they report seeing the Nephilim, and they say that they felt like grasshoppers by comparison. Notice that this report comes long after the flood, which is a genuine puzzle in the text, and one that the Genesis phrase and also afterwards seems to anticipate. The Book of Deuteronomy goes further, and it does something a legend rarely does. It offers a receipt. It describes Og, a king east of the Jordan, as the last of the Rephaim, another term the Hebrew Bible associates with unusually large peoples. And then it does something almost mundane. It tells the reader that the king's great iron bed was still there, in a city the reader could visit, and that anyone who doubted the story could go and see it for themselves. Read that again. The text is saying, in effect, if you do not believe us, go and look. It is pointing at an object in a real place that a contemporary reader could in principle have gone to see. Now, what was it? The dimensions the text gives would make it an extraordinary bed, roughly 4 meters long. Some scholars argue that the word rendered as bed may be better understood as a sarcophagus or a great stone burial structure of the kind found in that region. Others note that royal furnishings across the ancient world were regularly built oversized as a display of power, not as a statement about the body inside them. We do not know, and that uncertainty is the honest answer. But the pattern repeats. Consider Goliath, the most famous giant in the Bible. In the traditional Hebrew text, he stands close to 3 meters tall, enormous, a figure out of nightmare. But the ancient Greek translation, made by Jewish scholars centuries earlier, gives a different number. It makes him a little over 2 meters. And crucially, one of the oldest surviving manuscript fragments of the Book of Samuel supports the shorter figure. So the oldest manuscript evidence available to us describes a man who is very tall, but not impossible. A man who, in a population whose average height was well under 5.5 feet, would tower over everyone in the valley. Terrifying, in a way that the physical world permits. And this is where the archaeology becomes genuinely useful, because it explains something that no fabricated photograph ever could. Excavations across the ancient Near East have uncovered fortifications from the Bronze Age that are extraordinary in scale. Massive stone walls, built from blocks so large that later generations struggled to imagine ordinary human beings moving them at all. The ancient Greeks looked at similar walls in their own landscape and concluded that a race of giants must have built them. That is literally where the architectural term comes from. Human beings, standing in front of these ruins, reached for giants as an explanation. Now, put yourself in the position of a group of scouts entering Canaan in the late Bronze Age. They come from a semi-nomadic background, and they encounter walled cities, fortified with stones of a size they have never handled, defended by professional soldiers who are better fed, better armed, and physically larger than they are. We felt like grasshoppers. There's a version of that report that requires no supernatural explanation whatsoever, and it is still, in its own way, entirely true to the experience of the people who gave it. And then there is the wider ancient world, which was not silent about any of this. Ancient Mesopotamian tradition preserves accounts of the Apkallu, sages, often depicted as part fish or winged, who emerged from the waters before the Great Flood and gave humanity its civilizing arts: writing, law, craft, kingship itself. And in some versions of the tradition, after the flood, the descendants of these beings become a problem. Their knowledge becomes dangerous. Read that alongside the Book of the Watchers, and the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Beings from outside the human sphere. Forbidden or premature knowledge handed down before the flood. And a catastrophe that follows. Scholars debate what to make of this. Some argue for direct literary influence, given that the Jewish community spent decades in exile in Babylon and was demonstrably exposed to Mesopotamian literature. Others see a shared cultural inheritance across the ancient world, older than either tradition. Others still see two peoples independently reaching for the same explanation of a shared human intuition that something in the deep past went wrong, and that the wrongness had something to do with knowledge arriving before wisdom. What none of them argue is that the resemblance is a coincidence. It is too close for that. So where does this leave us? The 4 verses in Genesis are not an accident, and they are not a fragment left in by mistake. They sit exactly where the author placed them. Immediately after this passage, the text declares that the wickedness of humanity is great, that every intention of the heart is evil continually, and that God resolves to blot out what he has made. The Nephilim passage is the last thing you read before the flood. It is not a curiosity. It is the reason given. And that structure tells you what the ancient authors thought they were describing. Not a monster story. A story about a boundary. A line between the divine and the human, between what may be known and what may not be, and about what happens to a world when that line is crossed by beings powerful enough to cross it and reckless enough to try. The Book of Enoch made that reading explicit, and for a while, it was the dominant reading in the ancient Jewish world. Then it was set aside, and the safer interpretation took its place. And most people reading Genesis today have never been told there was another one. But the scrolls hidden in those caves were not written to be safe. They were written by people who read those 4 verses and understood them to be the surviving edge of something enormous. Fragments of a story about giants who dreamed of their own destruction, and about the sons of God who came down and who did not go back. What the text says and what the ground shows do not always agree. But on this, they circle the same thing. Something happened in the deep past that the people of the ancient world could not stop writing about in language after language, across centuries and empires that had every reason to forget each other. They kept telling this story. And whatever they were reaching for, they clearly did not think they were making it up. If you want to go further into this, the next place to look is the Book of Enoch itself, and specifically what it claims about where the soul goes after death, because that is where the text becomes genuinely strange. That is a story for another time. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.